So TISC report is our platform, obviously standing for Transparency in Supply Chains. I was told only 4 slides, but because I'm talking about non-compliance and bad compliance, I have more slides, but I will get through them quickly. Does that make sense? It would be worthwhile just defining what I mean by transparency. So in terms of corporate transparency, we're talking about what can be seen from the outside that has been shared intentionally by a corporation, and then you can start to assess the quality of it and see whether or not we can determine certain aspects of risk and corporate behaviour. With transparency, we can verify through third-party sources what is reported is actually true or not true. And with corporate transparency, we can make sure that supply chain transparency actually is impactful. So what we do on TISC report is, in terms of tracking compliance, we've been able to track relational ties. This includes supplier-buyer, about group interactions, parents, subsidiaries, persons of significant control. We can look at regulatory relationships, where they are geographically. We can look at interlocking directorates and dotted line relationships. And we look at that for the actors that are companies, departments within companies, NGOs and charities, even nation states where they have that data available, and public service agencies. But that's not the limit. It's just an example of where we've been focusing based on the work that we do with our partners. Problems we're trying to fix, well, we're a social enterprise, so we're trying to fix some of the bigger issues, but we see our job as data infrastructure. So all of the issues that we've been seeing out in the world, we think that if we can't establish truth, then we don't really know that we're fixing anything. So we focused on transparency from the data perspective in order to help make policy more effective. We've started with compliance and non-compliance because that data is out there already, and no one seems to be joining up the dots on the non-financial end of things, which is strange because it seems to be that's where the early indicators of risk might be. We also look at some of the community data sets that show an intention of a company. So if they're living wage accredited, then that might be a good sign. If they're aware of the Bribery Act enough to have a policy that's available, we can look at that. We can look at their trading names and how they're responding to data protection legislation. We can look at all sorts of things that give us an indication of the character of that organization. Now, here's the thing. With transparency, we need to make sure it is quantified. And the reason is that without that quantification, nobody really understands how to use it. And transparency has been very well defined for the financial side, and there are metrics and ways and means in which you can evaluate a company on what they're reporting financially. But there is no such counterpart in the non-financial end of things. And it should be a no-brainer that if you've got non-compliance in one area, it means that it's bad in probably the others, and there are other things to look at within that organization that might give rise to actual financial risk. But nobody seems to put 2 and 2 together, and nobody really wants to react to it. So we can come to an organization and say, hey, look, you've got 4 organizations that haven't met basic compliance requirements for Section 54 Modern Slavery Act, let's say. What are you doing about it? And do you not think that's a bad thing given how easy compliance is? And they don't seem to feel that is something that they can act on. Insurers need a judiciary. They need someone official from government to make that decision, because unless they do, they cannot then act on their own policy, which is we do not work with companies that are acting illegally. You would think that non-compliance was part of that illegal bag, but yeah, we're caught in a bit of a catch-22. And speaking of, well, of the world of banks and financial institutions, I've talked about non-financial risks on this particular slide because they care about financial risks, and they've articulated that non-financial risk is like the holy grail because it is the early indicator of financial risk. But they they don't quite know how they're measuring it. In the same way that you can say that ESG is this great big thing that people are starting to measure their investments in terms of, but very few have been able to talk about meaningful metrics for that. Our biggest challenge really is that we need to map non-financial risks to financial risks in order to be taken seriously, in order that those behavioral elements of those corporations are put into context of whether or not they're doing more harm or doing more good. And also, I suppose it's worth clarifying that with non-financial risk, it is really operational risk and strategic risk. They're both very complex to measure and monitor. So where can we start? So non-compliance is all over the place. We've been tracking some of the biggest companies in the country, in the world, as to how they've been behaving on payment practices, Section 54, gender pay gap, without any kind of enforcement. There is no real reason for a company to jump and comply. So you can see that there are serial offenders who haven't been chased. No one's done anything. We have tried to give this data to various different departments, but unless there's an appetite from government to act and enforce, it will continue to happen. And there's a gender pay gap data as well. So how can research help? So this is the big ask for me. I need researchers to start looking at this stuff. I need us to look at the outcomes that we're looking for, the desirable corporate behaviours, and also what we need to disincentivize the undesirable behaviours. We need to look at the data that's available, see whether or not it's there directly, indirectly, or if it's missing. And then we need to evaluate the impact on the economy, on the buyers, on the lives of workers, on the planet. And the key thing here is then to articulate it in a way that insurers, buyers, regulators, law enforcement, governments will be able to act on it. We need action. So we are a platform, or our own platform is tracking these sorts of relationships. And I would really love to talk to researchers about what we could do together collaboratively to start to put the meat on the bones of some of this stuff. I probably rushed through way quicker than I had done, but I will stop there just in case there are some questions.